He's the man, he's the myth, he's the legend, he's the scientist with all the answers and all the questions. It's time for another episode of Alex's Science Corner.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. No, please. Thank you. Well, that was nice and quick.
What's going on in the wide world of science?
All right, we've got a couple of news stories that there's been updates that either change a story or, there's questions and stuff. And it's always good when you hear a science story to try and go back to it, a few weeks later to
see if it's true.
Well, yeah, actually. One of the first story is, remember 2 weeks ago when the Chinese space station fell back to Earth?
Right, and they said they didn't know where it was going to land.
Right, and it fell back to Earth on Monday. They're expecting it to fall back to Earth on sometime on Saturday or Sunday. It fell back to Earth on Monday in the Pacific Ocean. Couple notes about that. First of all, that there's about 100 tons of debris that falls on Earth that we put up. Not just the dust and asteroids and that kind of stuff. There's 100 tons of human-made debris that we put up that falls back down to Earth every year.
Eventually.
So there's a lot of stuff that comes down back to Earth. Now, the part that brings this into the story, one of the things that we had mentioned when we were talking about it 2 weeks ago was that Brian had mentioned that he saw a story about somebody was saying that the Chinese technology was not as good as American or Russian technology because they didn't know when when the spacecraft was coming back in. And generally speaking, what it is that if you've got control of the satellite, you can push it down into a certain orbit so it comes down where and when you want it to come down. And if the Chinese couldn't control the ship, that's true. The thing is, the reason why they can control the ship is they lost communications with it a month beforehand. And that's just something that happens. And the same thing happens to Russian and American satellites. If we lose communications with it, then we can't control its entry. So the person who made the comment was kind of correct in that, if you can't control the entry and you still have communications with it, then you don't have as good technology. But on the other hand, if you put up a space station, you can have it orbit for several hundred orbits. You've got enough control. As long as you have communications with it, you have enough control to bring it down where and when you want. It's if you lose communications with it, that's when you lose. That's when you can't control its reentry. So the person was kind of correct that made that comment.
Can they program it before it's supposed to have come down, program it where it's supposed to land, and then if they lose communication, what happens?
What happens is, unfortunately, when it's getting down into lower Earth orbit, it starts getting affected by the atmosphere. And when it goes from the day side to the night side, the density changes and it slows the spacecraft down at different speeds. And that variability is more than enough to throw everything out of whack. Because this spacecraft does an orbit in 90 minutes. And so if you can't get that timeline down to, it's going to drop down into less than a 90-minute period, you're not going to know where it's going to come down. Because in 90 minutes, it's around the world. So if you can't get that timeline to less than 90 minutes, you're not going to know where it's going to come down. And if you don't have that final control towards the very end of it, when you can push it down towards the last bit, that's when you can tell it to come down. Because the variability in the atmosphere is more than enough to just throw things off. So you got to kind of have that control almost right to the last minute.
I see.
Next story is about 2 science papers. Do older brains make new neurons or not? So the question is once a person becomes over teenager age, like in their early 20s, there's a idea that you do not grow new neurons. Well, one research paper says you actually do. A second group of researchers using the exact same methods did the same study saying, no, you don't. So now you've got two studies that are asking the same question that are coming up with two different answers. And so the next step is for these two papers or these two groups, or even a third group or follow-on groups, to now try and figure out, did one of these guys get something wrong in their research? Did both of them get it right and they're just like missing something between them? But it's one of those controversies or one of those things that happens in science where you've got a question, it's going to take time to actually get the answer. If you had just gone with one of these papers, you're not going to get the right answer. And the answer is a yes or no, and the answer at the moment is don't know still.
That works for me.
So just going with one paper is not enough. This is something that still has to be researched, but people talked about either paper as if it was the answer so far. So that was a nice, interesting little study. The next one was a news article that came out a week before, and I didn't want to talk about it with the stuff I was going to do last week. The reason is the paper was about these researchers developed this new technique and say they've discovered a new human organ.
I saw something about that.
Okay, so what it is they found that the cells in your skin and through your regular organs actually have a lot more fluid flowing between them. There's like capillaries that have fluids flowing between them, so that makes the tissues more subtle. Sorry, I'm not saying that right, but it makes it more bendy and easier to stretch. They don't see that normally when you look at it under a microscope, because part of putting the cell tissue samples under microscope is you have to dry the sample. And when it dries the sample, it squeezes those capillaries, so you don't see those capillaries for the liquids. And it's not blood, but you don't see those capillaries.
Well, what's this organ they were talking about?
Well, it's this network of capillaries that let the liquid flow through. Now, last year we talked about the mesentery, and I don't know if you remember me talking about that, where medical researchers, if you go through different medical textbooks, they all give different numbers for human organs, because there's no good definition of what a human organ is or what organs are. And so it then becomes a political fight between different medical organizations and writers as to what is and isn't an organ. So when somebody says we've discovered a new organ, you know what? They may have discovered something new, but we're not going to get into that fight with the organ or not. So that was the story a week ago. And this is why you kind of want to wait, because last week, a whole bunch of different papers and articles have been coming out from other researchers, mostly pathologists, are going, the stuff that these guys say they've discovered, we've known about it for years. The interesting part about it is that these guys came up with a new technique for imaging this stuff without having to dry the cells. But we've known about this capillary action for years. The guys who did the research didn't know about it and say, oh, we've discovered, we got a new organ, let's us name the organ. But it's already been around. So it's like, yeah, the new technique you got, that's really cool. But what you're talking about is we've known about this. So it's one of those things, if you had listened to that initial news article, you would have gotten the wrong impression, because the people put out the press release, and this is the case where the scientists who did the technique got it wrong. Because they came up with this technique, but they didn't know what they're looking at. So they said, oh, we've never seen this before. It's a new organ. So.
And that, my friends, is Alex's Science Corner.
Thank you. Oh, the ending cheering. I think we can try and get Bobby to do the end cheering instead of the opening cheers.
I think she would do it.
Yeah.
All right. If you have any questions about these stories or anything else science-related right now, you can give us a call at 203-837-9924.